Welcome to this short film about bereavement. My name is Sinead McBurty and I'm the Chief Executive of Education Support. I'm delighted to be joined today by Erin Hope Thompson, who is a clinical psychologist and the director of the Loss Foundation, which is a bereavement support charity. And Erin is here to talk to us today about bereavement in the context of lockdown, of social distancing, and we're going to pay particular attention to issues that are affecting people working in education. Erin, welcome, and thank you for joining us. Can we start out by talking about what grief actually looks like?
That's a great question. It's a broad question, so it might have a broad answer. Grief is what we would, the definition of it is that it is a response to loss or bereavement. And in some ways, we can then consider grief almost a permanent state, because we will always have some kind of response to our loss, given it is so personal and meaningful to us. Grief comes with a whole host of different sort of symptoms or experiences. I think the most common one that anyone would sort of have popping to mind would be sadness. Of course, it is an emotionally overwhelming experience, but there is so much more to grief than just sadness. And I think actually if anybody had found themselves suddenly bereaved and looking online about what grief might look like, they might come across things such as the 5-stage model of grief. That is sort of a very popular model, I think, because it's visual and people like to have visual concepts of what they're going to be embarking upon. The 5-stage model is one that's actually a palliative care model. It's not actually a grief model, and there are all sorts of different grief models that people might be able to engage in that help describe the concept a little bit. It's something in which people would experience potentially anxiety, feelings of feeling physically unwell. It can definitely affect people physically as well as emotionally. In some ways, it affects people cognitively. It affects the thoughts that you have. Emotionally, the way that you feel, and behaviorally, it might affect the decisions that you make or the actions that you partake in. When people become bereaved, they tend to go into what we would consider an acute period of grief. And often in that acute period of grief, it's a very raw, intense time, and that's when most people get a real heightened sense of experiences or symptoms, so intense feelings of separation, distress, anxiety, sadness, difficult memories. There are all sorts of different experiences that come with it. And I think one really important thing to share about grief is that it can not necessarily look the way that everyone thinks it might. So actually, some people might say, well, I'm struggling to concentrate, I don't have an appetite anymore. All of this can be related to grief. Over time, most people might find that they start to adapt to this grief and start to integrate it into their life. That doesn't mean that they're over it or that it's forgotten, but that they are able to sort of re-engage with life in a meaningful way, whilst obviously, of course, still missing someone. To just sort of summarize a little bit, I would say there are a couple of elements that are really key in grief. One is the unpredictability. So actually, it's not necessarily a case that every day will just be a bit easier. It's a bit of a roller coaster. You often hear phrases like grief comes in waves or it's a roller coaster, and there's a real truth to that. I wish it wasn't the case, because then that would mean tomorrow would be easier and it would kind of be going like this. But it is like that. And it's important that people do know that, because actually, if you find that you've been doing okay and then you have a bad day, that does not mean you've gone backwards or that you're doing badly. That is typical of grief. It is unpredictable, and it's not something that we always feel that we are in control of. It's more in control of us. But it would be fair to say that it's a deeply intense emotional experience in response to losing someone that you likely love very much.
So there's a lot that will be going on, I imagine, for all of the people around the country who have experienced loss at this time. And of course, we have a disproportionate amount of loss happening right now. The other thing that's going on is that people are living in lockdown, and social distancing, even though that may change in the near future, social distancing seems set to remain part of how we operate socially for some time. How do you think that impacts people's experience when they are grieving, when they're bereaved?
Yeah, this is a particularly difficult time. I don't want to take away from anybody who's grieving outside of lockdown, who I'm sure finds that difficult enough. But this is definitely a different time. And we've had some insight from the people that we have been supporting and speaking to who are losing loved ones during this time and aren't able to engage in the normal coping mechanisms that they ordinarily would. And I think that's going to be the biggest difference. You know, actually, when people are grieving, they need to feel connected to others and well supported. And we're trying to drive that now in a time of social disconnection. And that is very, very difficult. And so it could be that people aren't able to rely on normal coping mechanisms like exercise, seeing friends, seeing family, even going to work. For some people, going to work means they've got a bit of structure that might keep them slightly distracted. If you take all of these things away, essentially you're giving somebody more time to think and more time with memories and thoughts that for them might be particularly difficult. And in this scenario, we would definitely be recommending that people try and create connection where they can. You know, a lot of organizations have transformed support, putting it online, making it accessible. And I know that's not necessarily people's favorite way to do things, but I would be definitely encouraging people to engage in those sources of support online. And it's an interesting one because I know that people have been doing house parties and positive pub quizzes and all things online. There also needs to be a space to talk about difficult things online. It can't just be about let's meet to have fun. It's let's meet, let's see how you've been doing, how are you feeling, how can we help? But I would say for anybody in this scenario, if they are finding it particularly difficult, that's okay. Again, it doesn't mean that they're doing this badly or wrong. Again, this is a particularly difficult time, and grief is socially isolating enough on its own. Adding these new restrictions, and it's going to feel very isolating. What we wouldn't want is anyone to feel like they're doing this alone without any support. We'd really want to tackle that sense of loneliness.
That's really helpful. We speak to educators all the time about their experiences and what it is that they find difficult or they might need support with. Something that has struck me recently is talking to people who will say, you know, there's been a loss in the wider school community. A grandparent who was routinely involved in dropping kids off has passed away. And in the normal scheme of things, I wouldn't necessarily spend very much time thinking about it. But somehow, because it's happened in this context, I feel affected, and I don't know if I should. Am I just, you know, being over dramatic? And so I guess that thing about people in education being affected by loss in the wider community, how do you think people can make sense of that for themselves, Erin, and the impact on them?
I think that's a great question. And I think actually lots of people in all sorts of different ways might find they're not responding or reacting in the way they normally do because these aren't normal times. So I think any expectation that, you know, we would feel the same way about certain things, especially loss, I'd throw expectation out the window a little bit because almost like you said in your question, loss is everywhere now. We can't ignore it. And in fact, loss is a really hard thing to turn towards and think about. It makes us feel vulnerable. It reminds us of the fragility of life. And maybe ordinarily we're able to sort of turn away from it a bit. But when it is all around us, that's going to be a lot harder to do. So maybe if things were looking a bit more normal, somebody in education would find that they weren't so affected by a particular loss, but in this scenario now they feel like they are. And that could be because loss is now at the forefront of their mind. It could also be that what's happened makes them feel even more closely connected to their community and therefore more deeply affected if somebody in that community is affected by loss. Another thing that's, you know, worth not forgetting here is that when we are generally just a bit more stressed or a bit more worried, we find it harder to cope with things in general. So given that a lot of people are feeling a lot of anxiety given lockdown, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot that's out of our control, it might be that resilience is slightly lower than it ordinarily would be, and therefore we could be finding other things more difficult than we might do in normal times. So I would say a really important thing there is to be normalizing that. You know, if somebody is struggling, you know, the question, you know, should I be feeling differently or doing differently? Again, should invite so much pressure. The way you feel is the way you feel. So maybe the better question is not, you know, why am I feeling this way, but what do I need? So if that might mean I might need to be speaking to colleagues or to my supervisor or my manager about how I'm feeling, or I need to connect to my friends more and just to get a bit of sense of connection myself. But these aren't normal times. So responding slightly differently, that would be expected, and that would be okay.
There's something in that reminds me of other conversations I've had, in particular with school leaders who maybe unfairly, but I think to some extent can be characterized as very strong and identify with being strong. And of course, at this time, have carried communities on their shoulders and been at the forefront of getting through that initial stage of lockdown and making education work, carrying tremendous responsibility. For leaders who are affected by loss, I think there's a little bit of what you just said that's relevant. But I think for many, there's also a feeling of, I haven't got time for this. I have to keep my head down. I have to keep going, and I have to keep making this stack up, because actually now we need to reopen schools in the next, couple of weeks. We need to be ready for that. I haven't got time. Do you have any thoughts for people who have that experience, who maybe don't have an awful lot of time to reflect? There might be things that really are affecting them, but they're trying to power through.
Yeah, another really great question, Sinead, and really relevant clearly for leaders in the education sector who are managing people. And I can totally empathise with that viewpoint of, I've got things to do, I've got to be seen to be doing this, and there's stuff to be carrying on with, and maybe I don't feel such a pull to stop and reflect. And, I would empathise with that view. And, I would also empathise in the understanding that actually going towards feelings of loss is actually a really difficult thing to do. Like I said, it creates a feeling of sort of vulnerability and fragility. So be you, a leader or not a leader, engaging in those things might feel difficult. And actually a really wonderful short-term solution is to not do that, because then I can just sort of crack on. And that's fair. And for some people that would be okay. My only concern about it would be that actually holding that all in might not be a great solution in the long term. It might get me through this short-term moment, but in the long term, what might that look like? And the example I always give is that we're actually all like hydraulic systems. And if pressure is building in the pipes, I'm going to need to turn that tap on at some point. We all need outlets. We are human. And so actually my fear would be that if someone was sort of just cracking on, be that in the education sector or somewhere else where actually I've got a lot to be doing, that the pressure would build and the pipe could burst. And for some people that might suddenly be, I'm struggling to sleep at night. I'm getting increasingly irritable. I'm really struggling to concentrate. I'm getting changes in my appetite. All of these are signs that there's not been enough outlet or time or space. However, that doesn't translate to sitting down, crying all day long, or drowning in our feelings, because I can empathize again with that. I've got stuff to do. But for me, it does sort of portray the importance of creating outlets in a way that feels appropriate for you in your role. So if it doesn't feel appropriate to be sitting down and sharing every detail with your colleagues, so be it. But it would be really important to reflect upon the appropriate way to give yourself the space to be with what is actually there. And again, that could be in supervision, management, journaling, talking to friends, all sorts of different things. The only other thing I'll add to that is that I think it can be, a highly beneficial leadership tool to model to your employees that it's okay to get upset. And I know that that's hard, especially if we're in such a busy sector like education. And again, there's things to be done. But there are all sorts of ways to help think about how can I model to my team that we do make space for this, and we value the opportunity to make our colleagues and team feel well supported, rather than feeling like they have to bottle that up. And sometimes that needs to be led by those at the top who say, listen, we do value the space, we do make time for this. And again, there are ways to do it appropriately, but I think actually it can be really beneficial for a whole wider team if they know that they can do this at work.
I think that very much fits with what we're seeing in the sector. And I think something I'm hopeful about is that mental health more broadly will become more commonly discussed. And we really make the move now away from thinking about it as something fluffy and somewhat unnecessary to recognizing this is core to who we are and how we operate, not least in education. Thinking about those teachers who are looking now at going back to school, whether it's in the short term or the medium term, would you have any particular advice for educators who will be working with children who have been bereaved?
Yes, I think that's really important. The first thing that comes to my mind is for that educator to get an understanding of what happened, even the very basics. Obviously, you don't need all the information, but actually having an understanding of maybe how somebody died in the family and what information the child knows. Because in some scenarios, it could be that the child is of a younger age and knows limited details for age-appropriate reasons. And so actually, it's really key that an educator knows what the child knows. just in case there's any oversharing of information that, you know, isn't to the child's sort of understanding, etc. So I think getting the facts sort of understood would be really important. Doesn't mean, again, you need all the details, but the most important factors. And generally getting a picture of how the child might be doing from the family. And then I think what would be really important in moving forward is having a space for that child to use to talk if they need to. Again, sometimes the most important ingredient is having that support set up. It doesn't always mean that people will use it. And again, there'll be ways that schools would be able to put this into place appropriately. So be that actually there's a space for that young person to have the allowance to go and speak to somebody, be that their form tutor or somebody else who's the right person for them to go to, should and if they need to do so. Of course, I think it's also important to just be also encouraging normality. So we wouldn't want to treat this young person extremely differently from their peers, because that might not be a helpful thing to do either. So it seems like the important balance would be to be creating the space to sort of support the child whilst maintaining a sense of normality and keeping education running in its sort of normal format. And again, not every young person is going to take up the support. Sometimes just knowing it's there is important. The only other thing I'll add to that, again, if you're in a close community and you're close with your students, etc., you might be very affected as an educator if you're seeing, you know, a young child very upset. And that would make me, again, reflect on the point of that educator having somewhere to go themselves to. It's almost a bit of a chain reaction. And again, in an appropriate way. So whether that's that they've got a line manager they can speak to, or a colleague to say, gosh, that was really hard to see that young person so upset, or they've got their own outlets, or, you know, for them. But, you know, we're all human. Seeing somebody upset is really, really hard. So it's important to support them as best we can, and then to support ourselves as best we can in the process.
That's really, really helpful insight, Erin. I suppose my final question to you is, you're a specialist in the field of bereavement. What types of support are available to help people when they're dealing with bereavement?
There are a number of organisations that can help provide support for people, and, you know, it might depend on what support people are looking for. For some people, they just want information, and you know, in my mind, information can be one of the most important interventions. Understanding, for example, what grief looks like, and so it could be that actually going online to really helpful organisations to find out a little bit more information, even YouTube videos that explain what grief can look like, or those different kind of models and how to conceptualize it. The organisation that I work for, the Loss Foundation, we specialise in supporting people who have been bereaved by cancer. And now also, given the pandemic, people who've lost loved ones to COVID as well. And we specialise in group support. That would be another format of support where actually people get to meet others who've experienced something similar. And that can be hugely cathartic and normalising how you're doing and feeling well supported. There are other organisations that do the equivalent for other losses. So be that suicide loss with SANS, or neonatal loss, which is SOBS. I think I've got those the right way round. And then there are child-specific organisations. So Winston's Wish is a child bereavement organisation, Child Bereavement UK. And because there are so many, another helpful way of putting it is that there is an organisation called At a Loss, and they are very good at helping you find support in your area. So if you go onto their website, put in your postcode and what you're looking for, up will come a whole host of different organisations. But, you know, the question there for someone is, what does it feel like you need? Do you feel like you need to speak to others around you? Do you need information? Do you need some one-to-one support? And, you know, CRUISE is a national bereavement organisation. I know they have a telephone support line. But again, given there are so many ingredients, it might be sort of worth going onto At a Loss, typing in your postcode, seeing what's available to you locally. The likelihood is at this point in time, a lot of it will be online. But I would really want to take away any stigma about that not necessarily being as helpful as in-person support. It can be just as helpful. It's just a very different format.
That is fantastic. And we will post some of the links to those resources alongside this video on our website. And just to remind anyone watching that, of course, the Education Support Helpline, you're also very welcome to call 24/7. That's a free and confidential service as well. So I think that has covered the main themes that we wanted to talk about. Erin Hope Thompson, thank you so much for your time. We greatly appreciate it. And we'll also be posting a link to some other videos from the Loss Foundation. Many thanks.
Thanks so much for having me.